background team of the Center for 21st Century Studies. Welcome, everyone. This is the first roundtable discussion from the UWM Center for 21st Century Studies. Our first roundtable conversation in our spring programming, Lonely No More, the making and unmaking of loneliness, isolation, and connectedness. Founded in 1968, we have a long tradition here. The Center for 21st Century Studies' mission is to build a community of scholars to address the pressing issues of our time. We are humanities at heart and interdisciplinary in action. As our prescient charter says, quote, cooperative humanistic research is most compatible with the task of addressing the complexity of 21st century challenges, and complex they are. I am Anne Basting. I'm the center director and lead of this rather incredible team of Nicole and the deputy director, the grad fellows, Randolph, Leah, and Nassim. You team have my full thanks for shaping this new format of the conference with multiple points of access and engaging multiple ways of knowing. This includes an entire podcast series called 6.5 Minutes With, which are just tiny bite-sized morsels that you have 6.5 minutes to spare just to get a taste of the background of some of the folks that we feature in our conference. An interactive book club where you'll find suggestions for things to read, almost all of the work of the people you see today and the next two panels as well, roundtables as well. A way to go deeper, to view and to read things. A participatory project, in this case for Lonely No More, it was a survey that we did and then a public report with a call for creative responses to that public report. And finally, as today kicks off, a series of roundtable conversations. Today, we unpack loneliness, a feeling and phenomenon that has become all too familiar over the last 2 years, but that, as evidenced by the work of our panelists today, has been rising in awareness for more than a couple of decades, actually. And I'm really thrilled and thankful to welcome the panelists today. Jason Danely, a reader in anthropology at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. Joan Johnson, director of the Milwaukee Public Library System. Eric Klinenberg, the Helen Gould Shephard Professor of Social Science and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. And Chikako Ozawa-de Silva, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Emory University. In the chat, you'll find a link to their full, rather amazing bios so that we can focus on the conversation today. Welcome to you all. Let's start with a little brief self-intro, just a couple of minutes on how this topic touches your work. And one of the things that we worked on in shifting our conferences at the center was that we were touching work that touches our lives as human beings, as well as the work that we work on, right? Reflect on and study. So of course, loneliness has touched our lives personally in the pandemic, but also is the subject of our efforts as scholars and as community leaders as well. We'll start with Jason. Your work has really focused on I keep saying beautiful because I just love your writing. I love the writing of everybody on this panel, but really beautiful, deep observations of aging in Japan. Most recently, again, a beautiful but harrowing article on the phenomenon of the lonely or unwitnessed deaths. And also an edited volume. If you could see, I have like a stack of all of the books over here of conceptualizing care. How does the topic of loneliness touch your life and your work?
Thank you, Anne, for that introduction. And what an exciting panel you put together, and what an important topic, loneliness. I'm an anthropologist, and I think as an anthropologist, my tendency, my inclination is towards connection. That's what I'm really interested in. I'm interested in connecting with people who are different than me, people who have different kinds of lives, and I'm really interested in that and curious about that. And you know, connections and relationships, that's the kind of thing that I was interested in studying in Japan. And I wanted to know how people experience that, how they created and maintain that through different kinds of relationships and over the life course and as they grew older. And what I learned as I started to listen to people and they were telling me stories and I was joining neighborhood associations and getting integrated into that community in Japan, was that there were a lot of people that were really concerned with social disconnection, what they saw as a real problem that was getting worse in Japan with social disconnection. And that wasn't only among you know, only for older people, that was also for young people. And I was interested in people who were caring for older family members, and they were often very isolated too. So there were a lot of different people that became very isolated. And I think for Japanese people who might identify as being more collectively oriented, that might think of themselves often as a, you know, I would hear often these sort of ways people would talk about themselves as a kind of interdependent society, you know, based in a kind of rice growing culture where everyone had to depend on everyone else to plant the rice, to irrigate the fields and everything. And they really identified with that. So this loneliness and this disconnection really hit a nerve. And I noticed that, and you know, when you look at Japanese history, there's been just massive social change over only a couple of generations. And you know, a lot of people have become isolated as a result of that, as changing families, changing communities, and others, and this has resulted in, as you mentioned, in a lot of people aging alone and dying alone. So so I had to listen to those voices, those people I was talking to, and that's how I became more attentive to this issue, and not only in Japan, but as it's affecting societies elsewhere.
Thank you. Joan, you stepped into the directorship of the Milwaukee Public Library System, which has 13 branches and serves well over 500,000 people, right in 2020, right as the pandemic was setting in the midst of it all. How does this topic touch your work? Loneliness, I mean, the breadth of it, loneliness, isolation, and connectedness. How do you see that? It's kind of an obvious question, but how do you see that touching your work? Mute. Joan, we're missing it. We're missing it. There you go. Oh,
yeah.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Thanks for the earlier introduction. And it's been fascinating to listen to what Jason's been working on. And I'm so looking forward to hearing from Eric and Chikako. As you know, as a person who's been working in public service for over 30 years, library workers, you know, so my experience is just my experience of working in the field of libraries for that amount of time. I'm not a researcher and I haven't authored any books on this subject or any other topics. So it's all been my lived experience working in the field. And library workers have understood for a really long time how important we are to the quality and strength of the social infrastructure within the communities that we are serving. For many of us, it is what drove us to public service. So patrons have long identified with specific, so my experience is this, and it's been no matter where I've worked, that patrons have long identified with specific library workers as their librarian, no matter what their job was in the organization. Everyone to them is a librarian, and that would be the person that they would look for whenever they visit. Or if they are calling our ready reference line, very often I have staff reporting that patrons will hang on a little longer than is really necessary after the transaction is complete, just to prolong that interaction. And over the years, we've talked about finding that delicate balance between how staff interact with patrons, first in a transactional way to honor the privacy of our patrons. That's really kind of how we are taught in library school, is to not pry about what people are asking about, to just respond to the question that's asked and then try to get to sort of the nugget of, you know, the question. Sometimes people don't know how to ask for what they're looking for. So we learn, you know, really in a really transactional way, how to navigate that reference transaction, and to keep it basically not to get too personal with it. But over the years, we've been, you know, really understanding how people really want more of a connection than that, and to move from the transactional to more of a relational interaction with our patrons. But we have to do that very gingerly and delicately, because we have to build trust as part of this process. So it is a delicate balance, and our staff are always learning how to be better at balancing those two things.
Thank you. And it's really fitting, Eric, that you would come right after Joan. Your multiple books address the increasing trend, really worldwide, of people living alone, and pulling apart loneliness from that experience of living alone. Looking at the social infrastructures, from the 2018 book, Palaces for the People, which actually is a quote from Andrew Carnegie, I understand, describing his vision for public libraries. How does loneliness touch your work?
Well, I mean, first, like everyone else, let me say thank you for organizing this terrific event and say how happy I am to be here. Whatever here means these days, but I'm here from New York City. It's interesting. I guess like Jason, I'm as interested in connection as I am in disconnection. It's true that I wrote a book about the fact that there are more people living alone in the world than ever before. But one of the surprising things I discovered while working on that book, and the reason why I decided to write it, is because, I learned that it's actually our interdependence that makes our independence possible. The fact that so many people are living alone in the world today is in some ways a reflection of the fact that we've built in modern society that all kinds of ways of being integrated and mutually supportive, and of living together. And we do that more or less well, at different moments and in different places. The truth is, and please don't repeat this to anyone, I've hardly written anything at all about loneliness, hardly studied loneliness at all. I as you kind of casually or implicitly referred to, I've insisted that there's a very strong distinction between living alone, kind of physically being alone, and feeling lonely. And I think we conflate those things all the time. So I wonder why we do that, and how we project the feeling of loneliness into different situations where it may or may not be welcome or appropriate. But I think that this tension between connection and disconnection, social integration, and the kind of psychological experience is fundamental in modern life. Jason mentioned that in the last several decades or generations, there have been big changes in Japanese social life, but the reality is that for a few hundred years now, since the kind of rise of big cities and the introduction of all kinds of technology into our daily lives, and the demise of kind of historic, traditional, small village-based societies, we've been dealing with what this means for our social and social psychological state. And I just find that endlessly fascinating. So I guess as a sociologist, I'm a little less attuned to the psychological dynamics, and I've been asking more in my work, what kinds of social conditions produce different forms of integration or disconnection? And how can we think about that, whether it's in the built environment of a neighborhood or a building, or in different kinds of social systems?
And that is exactly why I wanted to make sure you were part of the conversation. It's so great. Chikako, loneliness probably touches your work. You know, I was struck early on when Eric and I were talking in a kind of a preliminary conversation where he said, I don't actually do anything with loneliness. And I said, I know someone who does exactly that. And that is your work. Your 2021 book actually is called The Anatomy of Loneliness. And then also in a recent transcultural psychiatry, I have it right here, Toward an Anthropology of Loneliness, a special issue. If you could, would you mind introducing your work a bit and how you see loneliness?
Well, first, thank you, Anne, for putting together this exciting roundtable. And so looking forward to actually our dialogues and discussions. Like Jason, I am a medical and psychological anthropologist of Japan. My first book, Psychotherapy and Religion in Japan, was on Naikan therapy, a Japanese meditation practice for healing through increasing a sense of connection with others. Basically, it is a practice of gratitude, of recording the kindness of others. After that, I started the research project on suicide in Japan. My recent book, The Anatomy of Loneliness, started off as a project on studying suicide, but I came to realize that there is a much deeper and more pervasive issues at play, and that is loneliness. So while investigating internet group suicides, I came across a striking statement that one suicidal individual wrote on the suicide website. Quote, "I am too lonely to die alone. Won't somebody die with me?" Loneliness kept coming up in my research on suicide. Eventually, I realized my project was not on suicide, but on loneliness. Suicide is, in fact, only one aspect of this much broader issue. So as I researched loneliness, my understanding of it broadened and deepened. I realized loneliness is not just about being alone and not even just about social isolation. It is also about feeling unseen, feeling uncared for, marginalized, unsafe, and unloved. Then I started to wonder, why are so many people feeling this way? This led me to explore loneliness itself more closely. And I started to see that there is an epidemic of loneliness in Japan and in many other late capitalistic societies. This epidemic of loneliness is connected to many other social ills of our time. So I started to imagine what aspects of loneliness are unavoidable and which are avoidable. We cannot eliminate all aspects of loneliness because some aspects of loneliness are natural and inherent to the human condition. But severe loneliness is escalated by the way we have structured society and our political economy. So I really hear what Eric was talking about. So this led me to investigate the way loneliness is perpetuated and intensified by systems. We all exist in systems that can reduce or can heighten our sense of loneliness. So for that reason, I'm writing a lot on empathy, recent articles and books. Thank you.
Thank you for that. There really has been a burst of research on the health impacts of loneliness of late. And I'm really struck by sort of this internal, the old tension, the societal structures that are keeping this in place or creating the conditions for it. And then this sense of personal experience and personal change. The self-help movement around that balance in a lot of the health research, like what can you do as an individual, but then also looking at this structural layer. I think the changes in the last, even in just the last 5 years, with the UK creating a Minister of Loneliness in 2018, and then Japan took until 2021, as well as a task force assembled by the National Academy of Science here in the US, which created a report that landed on the internet in February 2020, just when people could start to read how terrible isolation was for their health during the pandemic, and also the ongoing efforts of the AARP, which has really been focusing on social isolation. What do you see as contributing to or holding up the rates of loneliness? And in some ways, we're focusing on that word loneliness because that's the lead of the Lonely No More, but it really is this network of loneliness and connectedness and isolation. What can contribute to alleviating the pain of loneliness or undesired aloneness? Anybody want to jump in there?
I'm happy to start us off. I'd love to hear what others are thinking. I was feeling like as and this kind of really, I think, is meant to sort of bounce off of what Chikako said about the empathy piece. And I think dialogue is so important to that. And so I was thinking about what's been happening the last few years, that as trust in our institutions erodes, especially government ones, so does a willingness to fund and abide the rules of those institutions. And then what's been happening is that we've been seeing this fracturing, more distrust. And I'm thinking perhaps that could be remedied if there was more opportunity for honest dialogue and sharing between disparate groups and individuals in order to counteract these deleterious effects of especially the social media algorithms that emphasize the negative and then, tend to sort of feed into people's rage or discontent, while keeping them glued to their screens. And so I just feel like this has been leading to alienation and more isolation. And then, I just feel that to counteract that, people's natural need to have a sense of belonging are driven to more and more extreme corners to find their community. But without that diversity, it's really, not much more than tribalism, which doesn't really feel like true community to me. And so a healthy society with strong social infrastructure has solid anchor institutions that are trusted by the vast majority of people, and functioning systems that allow for all members of our society to share in all of our benefits and share in our responsibilities as well, so that we can help each other realize our full potential, regardless of our race, our class, or gender. And I feel that libraries can really lead the way in creating a space for those dialogues to happen that I mentioned above. And so one example of what Milwaukee Public Library is doing is that we're collaborating with our local paper, the Journal Sentinel, our local public radio station at WUWM, and then our local public broadcasting service station here, along with a couple of other partners. It's called Listen MKE. The tagline is "Nothing About Us Without Us," and it's an initiative to create a space for discussion and listening on Milwaukee's North Side. And so this is a way to capture some of those people who feel like they're not being listened to, as Chikako mentioned earlier, that they're not seen, that nobody cares about what their experience is, what their lived experience is. So love to hear more thoughts along, any other thoughts that you guys are going to be contributing.
Thank you, Joan. It's like really creating a vision for what that lonely society or connected society, those two different visions can be. Eric, did you want to follow up? You're on mute.
So that's basically my favorite topic on earth. So yes, delighted to hear about the programming you're doing in Milwaukee. And of course, in the Palaces for the People book is about social infrastructure and has a lot to say about the central role of libraries as kind of critical infrastructure for the world we live in today. And people in Milwaukee are lucky to have those kinds of programs and this kind of leadership. And I hope everyone knows just how much the library is offering. Let me step back from that for a second, though, to say, the big paradox of our moment is that in some ways we're more connected than we've ever been. And we feel a sense of constantly, being plugged into a message system, a media stream, a kind of flow of information about what everyone we've ever befriended or known or even spoken to at a party is doing at any given moment. I mean, we're just profoundly connected. And of course, the paradox is at the same time, many of us feel that there's an emptiness to those connections and that we're not getting what we want from the kind of social life that's evolved in our screen-based culture. And so loneliness, we know, is this experience of our body telling us that we're not getting the kinds of connections that we need, right? I mean, we often talk about loneliness in crisis mode, but some amount of loneliness can be a healthy mechanism that the body gives us to say, get off of your couch, put down your iPhone, get into the world and find some deeper and more meaningful connection. And so I think the big challenge we face now is, as our media system keeps churning, as we, jump from our desktops to our laptops to our phones to Facebook to Twitter to TikTok and whatever it is that's already happening that I haven't discovered yet, but my kids know about, we keep finding it difficult to establish the kind of depth of understanding, depth of interpersonal integration that satisfies us. And you mentioned the algorithms. I think that's fair. They're driving a lot of the action, but clearly something here is off, and we're not getting what we need. I'm in the camp that says I haven't really seen the data that there's more loneliness than there used to be, that we're lonelier than ever. I get a little suspicious when I hear people talk that way. I don't doubt that there's real issues of loneliness. I just don't know that it's worse today than it was 25 or 30 or 50 years ago. I don't know how we would figure that out. And the data seem to be all over the place. But life is about trying to find a better and more meaningful connection all of the time. And I think it's really fair game for us to think about what's leading us astray and how we might do things better. One last really short thought on the kind of polarization issue, because I know when you're talking in Wisconsin, that's one of the key sites where you can see society fracturing apart. There is a little bit of a risk in this moment where we just talk about how we don't really connect anymore, that will create a new society where there's really strong and intense bonds and communication and depth of understanding for people on one side, and really strong depth and bond of deep communication for people on the other side. And I just want to say that wouldn't be a great scenario either. If we find ourselves in like some version of a civil war, we're tightly connected, but we're not especially happy. So we have to think about connection and meaning, but we also have to think about how we deal with difference and disagreement. And I have a sense that those problems are wrapped up in each other.
That's great. Chikako, I wonder if you could step in, because I know in your work you've done careful work of kind of categorizing degrees of the intensity of the loneliness experience. And I know there's already a little debate around, is there an epidemic? And it might also be culturally based, where we're talking about specific communities. But could you address that a little bit about the kind of the degrees of loneliness?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot, because it's amazing how so many of us are thinking about actually in similar ways. Eric hit a lot of this, loneliness is something the body is feeling something. And what it means about the deeper connection. But let me maybe start with, what loneliness is and it's not, because I spend quite a lot of time exploring what my understanding of loneliness and what loneliness may not be. So starting with what loneliness is not, I think the most common one is that thinking loneliness is the same as depression. Not all depressed people are lonely, and not all lonely people are depressed. So depression is considered a broader concept. And another common misunderstanding is loneliness means being alone. That has been already, refuted by many of us here. But being alone and being lonely are not the same. So being alone is one thing, but you can be physically alone, like talking about social isolation, but there are people who are physically alone, but not experiencing loneliness. My favorite example is like, this kind of meditator who has been meditating for many years in a solitary hut. These people don't experience loneliness. So loneliness researchers in general distinguish loneliness from social isolation and stress the cognitive appraisal and perception of experiencing loneliness. So talking about what and how I understand what loneliness is, I would like to start with John Cacioppo's, the leading scholar on loneliness, and his definition on loneliness as perceived social isolation. It's a very good, short and precise definition. But I came to realize from my own ethnographic study, from listening to people and following a number of suicide websites, that loneliness is not just perceived social isolation, but it is perceived and felt social isolation. So this is where I really resonated powerfully with what Eric just said. What do I mean that, right? Loneliness is a felt sense before we are even aware cognitively. We often cannot put into words what we are experiencing. Loneliness is not just a psychological phenomenon, but a biological and social one as well. So in the end, I came to my own definition, which is not as short as Cacioppo's, but here it is. So I define loneliness as feelings of dissatisfaction that arise with regard to relationships to others or to the environment. Why relationships to others or to the environment? We tend to think we have relationships with people and possibly with pets, but we also have relationships with social and physical places where we feel at home and strong connections. So a lot about what we find a meaningful connection or something might have a lot to do with also how, we need to feel other people. We are, after all, mammals, animals, we don't quite groom each other, but there's a difference between just meeting like virtually, but also feeling the presence of the person or touching the person, right? Like we feel so comfortable when somebody just pat on your shoulders, so it's okay. So, anyway, but these are some things I have been thinking a lot about what loneliness looks like to me. It's felt sense, it's in the body, and place matters. We have connections with places as well.
Jason, I'd love to bring you in on that as well, from your perspective. And I can already see sort of rippling ramifications about creating spaces of connectedness. And I'm thinking of both Joan and Eric's work and as it resonates across all of yours. But first, I think talking a little bit about the lonely society and how you're resonating with what Chikako is saying.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really everything that's been said here has been really fantastic, and I completely agreeing with all of you. So it's great. Yeah, I don't know. As you were talking, Joan, especially all these things were firing off in my mind. When you were mentioning the importance of trust. The importance of shared responsibility, right? And that kind of mutuality that can be fostered in places or through infrastructures like libraries. And I love libraries too. I remember as you were talking, I was remembering how I used to call the reference desk, when who calls the reference desk anymore? But that is fantastic, And I remember later on I worked at a library and people would call the reference desk and I'd see the librarians get all busy and looking up things, right? And they loved that. that. It was a very energized kind of thing, right? The search for knowledge, and I think that's been inspiring for me, right? But anyway, I love libraries, and they're important in Japan as well, where I've done my work. But yeah, the importance of places and these kind of third spaces, I think, and I think that's one change that we might be able to track, the kind of material infrastructure, physical infrastructure as well, that shapes the social infrastructure. When I look at things like the aging society and the lonely deaths in Japan, those are often accompanied by these sort of empty houses that are left there in Japan. They're called akiya, empty houses, and they're often too expensive to just demolish, so they're kind of left there for quite a while. And you have these neighborhoods that are full of these empty houses, these kind of haunted houses, and that someone might have died alone there. And so that kind of shadow, that kind of ghost, that kind of haunting is there in that aging society. And people think about it and reflect on it through the material infrastructure around them. I think about places where I did field work, like this area in Tokyo called Sanya. I've been doing work with guys who are coming out of prison, often guys who have gone back and forth from prison into the community, and they're often very alone, very disconnected, and they come to places like Sanya, where most of the people who live there in this district in Tokyo are single older men over 65. Almost everyone is on some kind of social benefits. They have lived most of their life on sort of precarious labor situations, so don't have a good pension, don't have a lot of security, and it's real tough living. Now, if you go there at the beginning of the month where they get their benefit check, you think this is a great place and it's very gregarious and everyone's out in the street, having a drink and things like that, happy to talk to you. If you go sort of mid-month or a little bit later in the month, you see the soup kitchens are filling up, you see people, it's a much darker kind of feel, right? It's pretty grim. Part of that is that there isn't that kind of sense of community or solidarity or trust, right? Now, I think that's part of that's, the kind of decaying sort of material structure, the people living alone in very small, sort of single occupancy kind of rooms and so on. But it also has to do with, I think, the policies and the social welfare system there. But then I can think of lots of examples of really, fantastic grassroots, sort of actions that have taken place in other neighborhoods in Japan that really sort of give me hope. Do I have a couple minutes I can talk about just one?
Please, I think
Okay,
it's a good transition.
I'll talk about just one. This is a community I lived in Kyoto, and they were concerned about children who were walking to and from school, right? Most school children in Japan will commute on foot. They're worried about cars and other kinds of dangers, and watching out for the kids. They're also concerned about older people living alone who didn't have a lot of reason to get out of their house anymore. So what some of these organizers did, these community organizers, is they said, well, we'll design this kind of pilgrimage, right? Japanese religion, there's a lot of pilgrimage and it's very popular. It's a well-known kind of religious practice. So they'll come up with that. And essentially it's a walk around the neighborhood. And around the neighborhood, there's 25 little statues of this Buddhist figure called Jizo, who's kind of a guardian of children. In a sense, and they had made a little map, and they told people about this, and it was really popular. A lot of people caught on to this idea. It was about Jesus. It was a cultural thing. It was a kind of a spiritual thing, but it was also a way that people just got out of the house and they had something to do. You didn't have to pay any money for it. They walked around. They met people. They bumped into people. They watched the children. They felt like they had a purpose. But it was using that infrastructure that was already there, repurposing it in a new creative way, and then creating all these social connections that weren't there, intergenerational connections or connections between neighbors, all of these things, and sort of remapping it, right? And remapping it not only in this sort of physical way, but emotionally, I think, rekindling these connections to the place, and changing the feelings. So, things like that people get into, that gets really popular, that connect with people on that local level, I think have the possibility of giving those opportunities to maybe prevent people from slipping into a situation where they're going to become lonely. Right? So thanks for giving me the time.
Yeah.
Love
No,
that example, Jason. The library has done walks as well, story walks using storybooks, children's storybooks, and then sort of, basically splitting it apart and putting it in various, storefronts or front yards, and then leading the walks through the neighborhood around the library to read the story. It's a great family activity. And there's also Jane's Walk, which sounds more like what you just described, that we plugged into. Those are really great ways to connect people to each other and to their community.
I have to give you one of my favorite stories from the New York Public Library system, because we've entered the point where we're seeing loneliness as a psychological and also an embodied experience, and the physicality of walking, assists in this integration into relationships with other people. And, I think, as Chikako reminds us, the environment in such a crucial way. One of my favorite library stories from the year I spent doing ethnographic field work in branch libraries came from Brooklyn, where I got invited to participate in what they call the Library Lanes Virtual Bowling League. And it's a program that some kind of entrepreneurial librarians set up, in some ways in a kind of a imagined conversation with this debate in American culture about bowling alone, right? Everyone remembers this book by Robert Putnam, which didn't actually even describe a real thing in the world. No one ever really bowled alone, but I think people just figured, the marketers must have figured out that that was the saddest two words in English language you could put together. So they made it work that way. And it became a metaphor for how isolated and disconnected and lonely Americans, were reported to have been. But in Brooklyn, what they figured out is that they could use technology to actually integrate in a pretty exciting way. So they invited older people in around Brooklyn, the exact people who were most likely to die alone in the heat wave that I studied in Chicago years ago, which I should say also had the same death rate in Milwaukee as Chicago, but because Milwaukee is smaller, it doesn't get the attention and love it deserves, unless the basketball team is really good. So they basically invited all these older people to participate in library lanes. And if you volunteered to come in, you got a free bowling jersey that had the name of your branch library on it. And then once a week, these teams of older people, most of whom lived alone, would assemble in the common areas, like a lot of like basement rooms, rec rooms of libraries, and a librarian would hook up an Xbox to the TV, and they would virtually compete against bowling teams made up of older people who largely lived alone from other branch libraries. And it was an extraordinary thing for me to see, in part because when I was with them, I couldn't stop thinking about all of the people who are living alone and aging alone and dying alone, in the United States and around the world, in part because there's nothing that's really calling them out into the world. There's nothing that's inviting them. There's nothing that dignifies their identity. And the library started to do this. And there was something very kind of physical and intimate and loving about these groups spontaneously forming teams, right? And developing this attachment to each other, and in part through their opposition to the other neighborhood libraries. And, Durkheim has this great concept that I can't stop thinking about these days called collective effervescence. And it's like the thing we've been missing these last few years in the pandemic, right? The notion is that There's something that happens when we come together physically as people. It's a feeling, it's a kind of elevation of our spirit. It's an exalting of our ordinary conditions. We feel a sense of joy sometimes, this kind of, we feel it in our bones, the depth of our connection, and there's often like a vibrancy to that experience. Durkheim was writing about religious life, and so he was interested in collective effervescence from religious ritual. But we have it in the modern world when we go to a great concert or a good sports event or a theater. Obviously, a good sociology or anthropology lecture does the same thing. But well, I couldn't help but notice, being down in these rooms, like the buzzing excitement that people felt being with each other. I took these photographs where you see just the intense smile on people's faces, and it's not the face that you expect when you see someone who's old and on their own. And it became very clear to me in that moment just how much an institution or a place can do to bring us into the world and give us that feeling of deep connection. And we don't need to have that feeling all the time, by the way. Just some of those experiences go a long way. And I couldn't help but think about how little time we spend collectively coming up with ways to produce those moments. I mean, I think there's people who run big concert ticket sales operations, or the NBA or the NFL, and they think about how to produce those moments. But we don't really do that as a public realm activity. We don't have leaders in universities or city governments who do it. And what was so striking is that here were these librarians in Brooklyn who figured out that that was part of their job. And so to go away from the psychological experience and into the conversation about policy and social infrastructure, and it seems to me like we should spend more time talking about the kind of world we want to build, not in this ethereal kind of aesthete way, but in a kind of a practical way. Like what are programs that we could invest in, and what are spaces we could build together? What are things we could do at the level of where we work, let alone at the kind of societal level, that would create the possibility for experiencing things like that? Because loneliness in the contemporary world is an inevitable experience. I mean, none of us will escape that feeling. I don't know that any of us want to escape that feeling. There's a lot of depth and meaning and new connection that comes from that feeling of loneliness, but we want to help people get out of the trap of this kind of severe, abject loneliness that leads to despair and a kind of vicious cycle of isolation that feeds on itself. And we can't do that if all we're talking about is like the best new app or the crazy thing that the last president just said on social media. I think we can only do that if we think about what kind of places we want to build. And that could be a place that's got a beautiful walk or a beautiful virtual bowling alley or any other number of things. There's no one way to do it. What's impoverished is our conversation.
That's great. Other folks want to jump in on the vision of sort of what society are we aiming toward? Chikako, I saw your hand.
Oh, yeah, actually, yeah, before moving to the question, so it was wonderful, Eric, just the way you moved it forward, thinking we moved to the next topic. So it's kind of two-step going back to the focus we are talking about the place and how library could be a place. So I'll be very short here. I just wanted to add one component to the place, because place has this physicality, like walking. That's one thing. So because I studied people who are intensely feeling lonely, when people are experiencing loneliness so intensely, having a kind of community, having kind of, mingling with people becomes so difficult. So a place could be a place, maybe that's a place like a library, you can mingle with strangers, meaning, sometimes that's easier. It's like lower, right, at the bar. I mean, the second is sometimes a place just that we actually have all experience of connecting with a certain place or two, even for no good reason. Like even we travel, we might connect with certain place. Maybe that's something about the air, maybe something about the quality of the air and smell and the temperature. I often talk about, well, when you're feeling so lonely and you cannot really do anything about it, think about the place you like, because that's also a kind of resource we can have. It's again connected with this whole library, right? Library has a place to walk, and I think most of us like library, grew up going to the library. So that's a wonderful space, having a both community aspect and also this physicality. So that's it. Thank you.
I think I'm just making a plug as a placeholder for the non-human kinship panel on what's the date of that, Nicole? I'm forgetting. She'll put
April
that in the chat.
13th.
April 13th, sorry, which really looks at the experience of aloneness with other, it could be the environment, it could be, so those spaces, I think, of really addressing that there. Anybody want to jump in? Of course, it's really hard for me not to just like spew examples from my work in aging and long-term care. But also, I think I'd love to hear about, now that we're talking kind of policy and structure, what are the things we want to invest in to try to create those networks or those spaces of connectivity? And I love, Chikako, your notion of like a place that has allows a variety of like steps for people, because we keep hearing people have forgotten how to be in each other's company. What are places and ways we can invest in places that allow for different kinds of engagement and building of belonging and trust and community?
So yeah, it's the question about what kind of maybe the ingredients for kind of so-called more connected society and ingredients for so-called disconnected society. Is that the kind of thing? Yeah, I think in terms of, I just use the word lonely society, disconnected society. I think these are like society that really makes people feel not meaningful, in a society that focuses on like instrumental values and productivity and competition to the exclusion of inherent values of each person. So a society that is like built on division rather than community and common humanity. I think that's probably why we are talking a lot about space and place, community. Place where we can kind of flourish, establishing the sense of community and common humanity. I think I just kind of wanted to, maybe say one thing about maybe that how loneliness is a much bigger and a deeper problem than people tend to think. For example, I think the core values of a society around productivity and performance lead to a sense of what I call instrumental values, when people's values are related to their productive values to society. So this is like inherently devaluing people's worth, and this kind of instrumentalization of human value is, to me, a core cultural concept at the heart of our social structures that promote loneliness. So in terms of the connected society and then what kind of stages can we build, I always use the word use of the imagination. We have to kind of be creative. I think in the field of the peace studies, there is a very interesting concept called positive peace, meaning peace is not just the absence of violence, but rather it is the presence of those things which prevent, violence. That means trust. It also means institutions that ensure fairness and justice. So I think the next stage for us is to imagine what would be those things that help to ensure the absence of loneliness in society. Maybe we can imagine like a family where the members don't talk to each other, don't trust each other, or don't support each other. fighting and undermining each other instead of supporting each other. So what makes a family a happy family, right? When the family takes care of each other and has compassion and empathy for each other, then that is a happy family. So society is not that different. Society shares things in common with families. So I think a society that values inclusion, acceptance, and respect based on compassion and empathy would be a connected society. So if we can make people feel lonely, then we can do the opposite too. That's the kind of thing actually that comes to my mind. And I'm kind of hoping for other, participants have like in concrete ways what could be done. I think about education as possibly a key. I like, Joan, how you talk about public library as something concrete, because it's connected to how I think about what education could do. So.
Anyone else have the specificity of the bowling story is what is so great. And I'm just thinking of, Jason, I was thinking about the unwitnessed death and the way you talk about housing. And if you see, it's such a great thread to pull on for a structural challenge that, especially in the Japanese situation of these of houses that are just, people are moving out and those houses are just being left along with the people. I wonder if you're seeing solutions or if people are talking about solutions in housing. An example I can bring in is Bridge Meadows in Oregon, in Portland, is a big continuing care retirement community that opened its independent living to young people who are aging out of foster care. And so it becomes an intergenerational housing opportunity through the coming together of different systems, and finding ways to reward and encourage those kinds of integrative solutions and spaces is just one example or an idea in the United States.
Thanks, Anne. That's a fantastic example that you bring up. And I think housing, or these structures, the way we're living, I think these are really important when we're thinking about how we make connections, how we confront loneliness. And so you're right, in my work that's on the lonely death, I looked at housing because in Japan, it's very important for people when they buy a house to buy a new build. And Japan has certain policies in which they have to build more and more houses, even though, there's not enough people to enter these houses, for economic reasons, to keep the housing market, I guess, supported, right? There's certain ways in which the government incentivizes building all these structures, and people are buying new houses. And so older people, rather than living together with their children and grandchildren, multi-generational households or something, rather than passing on that house to a child or something, they just sort of keep on living in it. And I think there has been a real push in the last couple decades towards keeping older people in their homes, this kind of aging in place push, right? Which, I think there's a lot of potential benefits to those kind of things, but I think it also has certainly gone along with, the rise in older people living alone. So there's been a huge rise in older people who are living alone in Japan. There's about 8 million, about 1 in 4 older people over 65, living alone now. I guess you could say from an aging in place, independent living kind of idea that that might not look bad. That's all right, as long as we can get care to them when they want. But I mean, I still think, in my experience and in my ethnographic work, a lot of people get in these houses that are getting older, that are getting decrepit, that people aren't coming around, and maybe they're becoming more frail. Maybe they're losing vision or hearing. If it's making it harder to communicate with people outside, so they just stay inside. It's easy, and they gradually become more and more isolated. And so the house becomes, rather than a way of staying connected to your community, it becomes this kind of trap, right? And you're kind of stuck in that house. And I saw a lot of that. So I think there are ways in which this focus on independence, the kind of way that sort of that discourse is promoted, can sometimes have that effect. I think I prefer, maybe there are other ways we can talk about this. I think I've heard sort of people talk about the distinction between that kind of independence and being very much on your own, and autonomy, where you find ways to get your needs met. It might involve other people, right? I might need a ride to the hospital or something like that, but I have someone I know I can call up and they'll give me a ride, right? Things like that. Being able to have those connections that enable you to do what you want to do, right? And having that balance, I think that is really key and important. So yeah, I think the way we're living, we have to look at different kinds of options. I think, and that means really addressing, the situation with housing. I haven't seen a whole lot of that in Japan, but I think they're going to have to face that and come up with different kinds of alternatives. But I still think that it's nice to have your home, to have your own place and everything. We need more common spaces. We need lots of these more common spaces, and these have been, I think, gradually enclosed, captured, all of these things.
Jason, I really like that idea. In the when I wrote this book, Going Solo, I landed inevitably on this question about housing, especially for older people, because and I'm kind of eager for you to jump in here. I know you've been so modest about doing it because you're letting us all speak, but you know more about this than the rest of us do. But there are more people, there are more old people in the world than ever before. There are far more older people living alone than ever before. And one of the tricky things that we think of as a Western phenomenon, but is in fact much bigger than a Western phenomenon, is that because of modern cultural changes that are quite common, for most old people, one's sense of dignity and integrity rests on your capacity to maintain the notion of that you're capable of living independently. And in so many societies, including in Asia, including in the Europe and the United States, if you're older and people want you to, even if you're living alone, if people want you to leave your home and go into some kind of shared communal setting, assisted living, or living with family members who can take care of you, it feels these days like a statement that you're no longer capable of taking care of yourself, and that's something you take pride in. And so there's this kind of deep cultural problem, which is that like in the United States, for instance, we have more younger people who want their older solitary parents to move in with them than we have older single people who want to move in with their kids. So it strikes me that one of the problems here is that we failed collectively across the world to think of compelling housing solutions that do what you are calling for, Jason, that provide people with the feeling, that allow people to maintain the feeling that they have the capacity to be independent, whatever that means, and with scare quotes around independence. That feeling of the capacity is really important, but that also connect them to friends, to neighbors, to programs, to libraries, to services, right? We have this kind of high-end assisted living, thing in the United States, which is pretty lovely for the very small number of people who can afford the outrageous fees they charge for it. And then we have these kind of god-awful, terrifying, institutionalized nursing homes, which everyone wants to avoid because they feel like death. And certainly during the pandemic, they were the most dangerous places on earth around the world. And so I think what you're saying, Jason, is really important because it's pushing us to spark a conversation, not just about libraries and parks, but also about how do we reimagine the home and the home as a complex of places, right? Not just the private apartment, but also the things that are attached to it and connected to it. And in remaking homes, we start to think about remaking society. I'll say one thing here to close, which is I've been spending some time in Singapore over the last several years for a bunch of different projects. And Singapore has been, very aggressive about relocating older people so that they can be closer to their families and kind of setting up these housing connections so people are close together. And it's a mixed bag. In some ways, people like to be closer to their kids, but if the impression is that there's a kind of heavy-handed government that's going to tell you where you need to be and remove you from a place that you have made as your home, that doesn't feel so good to people.
Something happened to your sound here.
Yeah, your sound went out.
Am I back now?
Yeah, you're back.
So anyway, I think, I kind of want this to be an invitation for you to join the conversation because I know it's the kind of thing you're thinking about, but this is just massively important.
Well, I think
Before Anne jumps in, I really would like to jump in real quick here to just share that there has been investment in Milwaukee and other cities. We were doing this in Seattle as well, striking public-private partnerships to lower the cost of building libraries. So in being able to continue to invest in new facilities and upgrading and modernizing our libraries, we've partnered with developers to create mixed-use facilities that include housing and we've done this now 5 times in Milwaukee. The very first one was featuring, all of them have a special theme in order for the developer to maximize on the credits that they get, tax credits, or to maximize on the grants that they would get from the state's programs for housing. So there has to be some kind of component for low income housing or some kind of veteran housing. And our first project was grand family housing. So the catch there was that it would be lower to middle income, but like below market rate housing for at least a percentage of the units in the building in order for them to get the funding they needed, the credits that they needed. And then he would have all this common space that was part of the development. And so in the case of our first project and all the other projects, it was the library space on the ground floor, apartments on the 4 or 5 floors above. There'd be sometimes a green space or a courtyard incorporated so that you are co-locating this housing with other amenities. So if more investment like that can be conceived of in certain situations, it might not work in every community, then, making those investments, whether it's, in this case, public money and private money, it could be all public money, it could be all private. But I think to touch on what Eric was saying about sort of that co-location piece, to really be thinking about that to help sort of extend the years in which someone can be independent by making it easy for them to access the things that they need to live.
Thank you for that. And I love those integrated public-private partnership libraries on the east side and another, I can't remember the other branch too. They're just fantastic. Excuse me. The one thing I was going to say is kind of I'm all about trying to connect all of you all to speak, but from my own view, I think it's when there's this inability to address needs of people. We can't conceptualize addressing people's needs as living alone, like how do we get those, and also people feeling a sense of being needed. And this was something I really pulled from Chikako, from your work, particularly, you know, older people and the housing issues that we were talking about, but so profound, this sense of despair of the young people that you looked at in the suicide in Japan, which is just heartbreaking, and these expressions of having not being needed and having no sense of purpose. And so I think of these innovations in policy and social infrastructure that address both the needs and and one of those needs is being needed, that both of those things are engaged. And I also think about you know, the branch library model. In my own work, I'm talking about just refusing the separation of arts and culture and health and social services, that these things should all be integrated systematically, like some of the social prescribing programs that are happening internationally, that those things are starting to use the same systems to reach people. And is the branch model of the library something that is possible for the art museums and the landscape, you know, the botanic gardens? Shouldn't they be integrated in some way into the neighborhood culture, the neighborhood model, so that we're interspersing more and investing more in these third spaces as well. I'm mindful that we're at 2:14, and I want to encourage the folks in to start writing some questions in the chat, but also to see if from the conversation that we're having here, and thank you for this, if you all have questions that are arising, or that you still have questions that remain around this issue. And just jump in there, and no one needs to be on mute. At least the panelists. We'll read the questions from the chat.
Well, I do want to say really briefly on this point you brought up, the feeling of being needed and being kind of having a voice or a place. I think we haven't touched much on the gender of loneliness or disconnection, but there is this really striking phenomenon about the extent to which you know, men suffer from loneliness and really fail to manage it as they get older, and their role in society and the economy changes. And one of the things that was so striking to me when I wrote the book about the heat wave is that, you know, men are so much less likely than women to age alone, you know, largely because women tend to outlive men, but it was totally clear from the death patterns in Chicago that men were infinitely more likely to die alone. And it really spoke to this kind of collective incapacity to kind of reinvent the world for you know, people whose labor is not used in the same way it was before. And I think actually a lot is changing in the gendered nature of social life. I think the one nice thing about the rise of phones and social media is that each individual person is the author of their social life in a way that was not necessarily true for our grandparents' generation, where the woman was often the social capitalist and the man kind of rode on her coattails. But I think it's unclear, and I think that this just something I'm curious about. I wonder if other people have thoughts about you know, the gendered nature of our connections.
Chikako?
Yeah, well, actually, you ended with the gender nature and connection. So I was actually going to echo and continue on this kind of sense of not needed. It's so intense among aging men, because I think you're often talking about post-retirement, and that's kind of connected to kind of my call for the need. When you talk about social changes, right, like the social value is kind of a collective value that is shared among so many people. But I think US and Japan and many late capitalist societies share this value that somehow productivity is so important, over many things. But then if you have that kind of society that prioritizes productivity over other things, compassion, competition over being kind to other people, then what happens is we are going to fall into the category sooner or later. We all age, we all get sick. So I think that's where you're talking about, what kind of society we can create so that people don't need to suffer from not being needed or not cared for. How do we build a compassionate society? So I really like this physicality of what kind of infrastructure we could build. Because yes, this gender disparity among, that the sense of loneliness is a severe one. And I wonder whether just rethinking about, value, social value, maybe also a way. And that's why I often talk about education. It takes a long time, but K to 12, I'm talking about early education. What about, right? Compassion is not just like self-sacrificing on, for the sake of something. Actually, it's a win-win situation. If you're nice to people, people are going to be nice to you when you're in trouble. So I actually like to thinking from the kind of, small scale and what could be done at the societal level. But anyway, more to thinking, but I will be quiet.
No, that's great. Other questions that remain, or touching on the point of gender, the gender of connection. Jason, are you getting ready?
Well, I wanted to say something, I guess, about this provocation about needing, getting your needs met, but also being needed, and I think that to me is absolutely key. And I know you know the literature on this, but from when I look at neighborhoods or communities that are thriving despite all these social changes that mean some people are living alone, those are communities where people's needs are met, right? They're not sort of day-to-day sort of surviving like some of the guys in Sanya, a lot of the guys in Sanya. It's their needs are basically met, but they're not so well off that they're totally independent. They don't need anybody else. There's still a sense that, yeah, I need, my neighbors to help me out sometimes. I got to help them out sometimes. And, that's kind of the way life is. And that's sort of ingrained in that culture, right, of that community. And then they have maybe neighborhood associations or other more formalized ways of connecting people. And maybe they have, these events, these collective effervescence kind of things that are also part of the tradition of the heritage of a community, right? And this is connecting different generations and so on as well. So I think all of that, I mean, that's absolutely key. Like you've got your basic needs met, but also you're needed by your community and they need you. And over time, you build that history with each other. So I think that's a great way to kind of keep it simple, but set up forth a kind of agenda that all different kinds of institutions could then be fitted into, right?
We have a really solid community of volunteers that help us with maintaining and processing some of our special collections. That is a small community of older people who are that really reliable group of volunteers that are here on a regular basis. They have a routine and a schedule, and they can rely on that. And they know that when they come in to work with the materials and with the staff, that that's something that's going to be here for them. It was a little challenging during the pandemic because we had to shut everything down and we were not able to really support that community during the 2 years that we didn't have anything extracurricular really happening. And so I think that was a really big loss for some of our elders who really rely on the library as their place to come and do that work together. We're slowly reinstating services and hours, and we have yet to bring that back yet where volunteers are able to come in again. So that was I think a big hit to some of our regulars as a result of the pandemic. but that sense of being needed is really greatly fulfilled by a lot of the volunteer work that people are doing, not just in libraries, but in other organizations as well.
We do have one question in the chat.
Yes, I saw. I'll get to it in a second because I think it's perfect. It's a perfect link to some of the work that Chikako has done. I think that the one of the questions around the rhetoric around loneliness and its kind of ascendance might give us a way to assert the need for social infrastructure, since it's a lot of the research on loneliness is really centering around health impacts and economic costs, and that it might legitimize an investment in social infrastructure in the ways of that we're talking around in housing, in landscape, in even volunteer networks, in a service corps concept, in starting to give us some language around that. I want to address one of the questions, which is really centering on refugees, increased immigration. I think in an unsettled climate, we're going to get more and more of this experience. And I know, Chikako, you've talked about this in your book with some of the people who were displaced by the triple event of the earthquake and the tsunami and then the nuclear disaster in Japan. How can we design for welcoming and integrating is the question. And I throw that to you, just since you really have looked very clearly at that.
Well, thank you, Anne, for picking up such an important, and right now it's a very serious issue about increasing number of refugees. Yeah, when I thought I finished, collecting my data on the book, this 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and the nuclear disaster happened in Japan. So I ended up following a group of people who survived, but of course relocated. And then that's when I realized actually how a place plays a major part in people's sense of loneliness. People who are in displacement experience severe experience of loneliness and feeling so disconnected. What I learned among people, and maybe perhaps their need, who are displaced or had to migrate in a refugee status, is one thing I really realized was so many people refuse this top-down mental care supports. It's like, we don't need that. Like, they don't understand what we have gone through. We are sick of this kind of top-down mental care. But what people really appreciated was the more community activities, like a small art product, let's make these products. That kind of workshop really brought people who are aiding and suffering together through this act of creative, creation. Others was actually, many people felt like, don't treat us just mere victims, meaning we are powerless. We had this kind of, recipient of support. Many people really had negative attitude to that. Don't treat us that way. What we need is having somewhat active social roles so that we feel we are meaningful. We can do something. Like, people who experience tsunami said, well, tsunami is something many people don't know. The first wave of tsunami is bad, but many people went back to collect their belongings between the first and second tsunami. So they felt like they can be a kind of narrator of the tsunami. That is one way they can be some actually great active social members to the society. So I think these aspects, just again, think about the need. What do they need? Their needs are probably quite different from what other people who are not in it can think about. So,
and I think too about the longing, the loneliness for home and where home is created. That's great. There's also a note here that I will use as a transition to the another of our conferences that we'll be doing next spring. A comment in the chat. People have been talking about building things, and I wonder what people think about the prospect of reclaiming public spaces, publics in our unfurling post-pandemic present. And what that draws me to is also our next topic is called Nourishing Trust, around food and farming justice work, a sense of building that trust that is what draws people into community and connects people as well. So I think we'll talk about reclaiming spaces for growing and farming in urban and rural areas, and using that as a connective community building tool as well. I want to thank everyone. This was really great. We have this set up as an opportunity to share the transcript with all of you, and then to have you add to it and comment on it as an ongoing way to build this, because there's so much left to say as well. So we'll be able to look for that. This is of course recorded and will be available online. And please dive a little deeper into both Chikako and Jason did 6.5 minutes podcasts as well. So you can look for those there. And then also much of their writing and their work is available in the Interactive Book Club as well. I give it to my team to close us out with a reminder of what's to come. Nicole, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so just having everyone attend to the chat here. Leah, one of our fellows, has added quite a few resources focused on Lonely No More in our programming. We have 2 more roundtables this semester, and then in the September, we have a UWM campus-focused roundtable for Lonely No More. Next one is Non-Human Kinship. That will be April 13th at the same time, 1 p.m. Central. And we hope that the speakers across the roundtables can attend. If you cannot, we're also thinking of sharing the transcripts across the roundtables, so to keep the conversation going. But otherwise, you can continue to go to our website, uwm.edu/C21, where we have all the resources to the podcasts, all the registration links for all the roundtables, and of course, the call for creative contributions, which we encourage you to share widely with your classes, with your community members to think about contributing to. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming today. And this is actually also when I'm going to stop the recording.